On July 20, 1944, the fate of Nazi Germany hung in the balance. A group of brave military officers and conspirators, united by their hatred for Hitler and the horrors he had inflicted upon the world, set in motion a daring plan to assassinate the Führer and overthrow the Nazi regime. Operation Valkyrie was their last desperate hope, a chance to turn the tide of the war and alter the course of history forever. But what if the resistance had succeeded? Picture this: the bomb detonates inside the Führer's command bunker at the Wolf's Lair. Hitler, the man whose decisions had led to the deaths of millions, was supposed to die. The conspirators, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, General Ludwig Beck and others, were ready to seize power to put an end to the bloodshed. But as fate would have it, Hitler survived. The resistance collapsed, and the Nazi regime tightened its grip. Thousands of plotters were executed and the war raged on. Now imagine what might have happened if, against all odds, the assassination had been successful. Would the German military, under the leadership of the conspirators, have been able to negotiate a peace with the Allies? Or would the world have been plunged into even greater chaos? What if Germany, in its final moments, chose to turn away from its fascist past and stand with the West against the Soviet Union? Would the post-war world have been forever altered? Could Europe have avoided the Cold War and the division of nations under the shadow of the Iron Curtain? These are the questions we'll explore today in this alternate history scenario. So stay tuned as we dive deep into what could have been and how a single moment in time could have changed everything. Before we begin, if you love exploring history's most intriguing what-if moments, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're on a mission to reach 70,000 subscribers by the end of this month, and your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey, and now let's get into the video. Operation Valkyrie was one of the most daring and fateful plots of World War II, conceived by a group of high-ranking German military officers and conspirators who had grown disillusioned with Adolf Hitler's reckless leadership. It was their final attempt to end the war and save Germany from the destruction Hitler had brought upon it. The plot was led by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, a German army officer who was deeply affected by the horrors of the war and the devastation caused by the Nazi regime. Stauffenberg, a man of great courage and conviction, was joined by key figures such as General Ludwig Beck, a former chief of the German General Staff who had resigned in protest over Hitler's policies, and Major General Henning von Treschow, who had long been a part of the resistance. They were all united by a common goal: to rid Germany of the tyrant at its helm. Alongside these men were a network of other military leaders, conservative patriots, and even civilians who, despite the personal risk, believed that overthrowing Hitler was Germany's last hope. The mounting frustration within the German resistance was rooted in the sheer failure of Hitler's leadership. By 1944, Germany had been pushed to the brink of collapse. The once feared Nazi war machine was being crushed on both the eastern and western fronts. The Soviet forces had begun their Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, devastating the German army on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, the Allies had launched Operation Overlord, landing in Normandy and gaining ground in Western Europe. The war was spiraling out of control, and Hitler, despite the overwhelming evidence of defeat, refused to acknowledge reality. His refusal to allow strategic retreats, his micromanagement of military operations, and his stubbornness were driving the German forces to ruin. For many in the resistance, it became clear that as long as Hitler remained in power, Germany had no chance of winning the war. The plot to assassinate Hitler was born out of these frustrations. The conspirators knew that for the war to end, Hitler had to die. And so they devised a bold plan to kill him and seize control of the government. The mission hinged on a single moment, an opportunity at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia, where he was scheduled to meet with his senior officers on July 20, 1944. Claus von Stauffenberg, who had been personally involved in the planning, was entrusted with carrying out the assassination. He was to plant a bomb in a briefcase and place it under the table at the meeting. With Hitler sitting just feet away, Stauffenberg set the plan in motion. As the meeting began, Stauffenberg discreetly placed the briefcase under the table, next to Hitler's feet. With every second that passed, the tension within the conspirators grew. There was no turning back now. The bomb was set to detonate in minutes. As Stauffenberg left the room to return to Berlin, the world held its breath. With every second, the fate of the world hung in the balance. The moment of truth had arrived. But when the explosion rocked the room, something went terribly wrong. The bomb didn't kill Hitler, and the plot began to unravel. The conspirators, who had placed their trust in this one moment, now faced the crushing realization that their hopes for Germany's future had slipped away. But for just a moment, they had dared to believe in the possibility of a different future. The moment the bomb exploded in the bunker was charged with anticipation and fear. Inside the small confined room of Hitler's military headquarters, at the Wolf's Lair, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg had set the stage for history to be rewritten. He had carefully placed the bomb in a briefcase beneath the table where Hitler sat with his inner circle of officers, confident that the moment of action had come. The clock was ticking. Every second brought the potential for success, the hope that Hitler, the man who had brought so much suffering to the world, would finally meet his end. As the explosion rocked the room, a deafening blast echoed through the bunker. The moment was supposed to be a turning point for Germany, perhaps even for the world, but fate had a cruel hand to play. The briefcase, positioned directly beneath the table, was jolted when an officer accidentally pushed it to the side, shielding Hitler from the full force of the blast. The bomb's deadly shockwaves were contained by the heavy oak table and the thick walls of the bunker. Hitler, though shaken and injured, survived. The world held its breath as the would-be assassins waited for the news that would change everything. But the sound of chaos that followed marked the beginning of the end for the resistance. While the initial explosion had provided hope, the failure of the assassination was sealed by a series of fortunate coincidences for Hitler. The thick walls of the bunker, the strategic placement of the briefcase, and sheer luck all conspired to save the Führer. The would-be assassins were left in a state of disbelief, watching as their carefully orchestrated plot began to collapse. It was a tragic irony. While one part of the resistance celebrated, another part was already doomed. The plans they had put in motion were falling apart, just as the opportunity for a new Germany slipped away. The failed assassination was not just a missed chance to rid the world of one of history's most infamous tyrants. It was a devastating blow to the resistance movement itself. In the wake of the explosion, panic and confusion spread quickly throughout Germany. News of the assassination attempt failed to reach the conspirators as quickly as they had hoped. They had planned to seize key government buildings in Berlin, to swiftly take control of the military, and announce Hitler's death to the world. But as it became clear that Hitler had survived, the resistance's tenuous grip on power started to slip. General Ludwig Beck, one of the central figures in the plot, was one of the first to realize that the assassination attempt had failed. Along with Colonel Stauffenberg, Major General Henning von Tresckow, and other key conspirators, Beck took urgent action. They issued orders to reserve army units and radioed for military commanders in Berlin to seize government buildings and cut off communication with the Nazis. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to take control of the country before the SS could retaliate. But the clock was ticking, and time was running out. The swift retaliation came almost immediately. As the conspirators scrambled to execute their plan, the SS moved into action, arresting and executing many of the plotters. The remaining conspirators were hunted down relentlessly. Stauffenberg, Beck, and others were captured, their hopes crushed in a whirlwind of violence. Their efforts, once so full of promise, ended in failure and death. By the time the resistance realized their desperate mistake, it was too late. The SS had regained control, and the hopes of a different future for Germany had been extinguished. The plot had failed, and the Nazi regime's grip on Germany tightened once again, this time with even more brutality. If Hitler had died on July 20th, 1944, the immediate shift in power within Germany would have been profound. The military, led by figures like General Ludwig Beck, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, and other conspirators, would have seized control of the government. Beck, who had long been opposed to Hitler's dictatorship, would have emerged as the leader of the new provisional government, stepping into a leadership role that was once unthinkable under the Nazi regime. This shift in power was not just about removing one man. It represented an ideological break from the path of totalitarianism that had led Germany to ruin. Beck, with his military experience and vision for a post-Nazi Germany, would have tried to stabilize the country, which was already reeling from the effects of war. One of the first things the new leadership would have done was attempt to negotiate a peace settlement with the Allies. They would have likely argued that Hitler's death marked the end of Nazi tyranny, presenting themselves as legitimate representatives of a new, more reasonable government. The conspirators, knowing the dire state of the German war effort, would have seen this as their last chance to save Germany from further destruction. However, this new leadership would have faced immense internal chaos. The Nazi regime, with its extensive control over the government and military, would not fall quietly. Many high-ranking Nazi officials, including the loyalists of Hitler's inner circle, would have resisted the coup. The SS and other Nazi factions would have fought tooth and nail to maintain control, plunging the country into a brief but intense power struggle. The resistance might have been able to suppress the Nazi holdouts in the short term, but the internal instability would have made it difficult for the new leadership to act decisively and effectively. The real question, however, was whether the Allies would have accepted the new German leadership's peace overtures. Given the nature of the war and the distrust between the Allies and Germany, it is unlikely that they would have been willing to negotiate a peace deal with a country that had caused so much devastation. The Western Allies, led by Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt, were committed to the principle of unconditional surrender. They believed that only the complete and utter defeat of Nazi Germany would ensure the prevention of future conflicts. Even if the new German leadership presented a viable offer of peace, the Western Allies might have viewed it as a ploy or a bluff. The psychological toll of the war, the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, and the hardening of Allied resolve all played a role in their stance. Joseph Stalin, on the other hand, would have had a different perspective. Having borne the brunt of the war on the Eastern Front, Stalin was deeply suspicious of any German overtures. His priority was to secure Soviet control over Eastern Europe, and he had little interest in negotiating with any German government that could potentially regain strength. The Soviet Union had suffered unimaginable losses, and Stalin's ultimate goal was to ensure that Germany was fully defeated and could never again pose a threat to the USSR. Thus, while the new German leadership might have hoped to negotiate with the Allies, their efforts would likely have been met with rejection. The war would continue, but now under even more difficult circumstances for Germany, as the Allies, unwavering in their resolve, pressed forward with the goal of unconditional surrender. The divide between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would only grow deeper, setting the stage for the Cold War as the ideological and political divide in Europe began to take shape. The death of Hitler may have marked the end of one era, but it would not have been enough to avert the global conflict that would reshape the world forever. In the wake of Hitler's death, Germany would have faced a deeply divided leadership. On one side, military leaders like General Ludwig Beck and Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, who sought to end the war and secure Germany's future by negotiating with the West. On the other, hardline commanders who believed the Soviet threat could still be held off and that Germany should continue fighting. The new leadership would have had to balance the need to keep the Eastern Front from collapsing while also opening peace negotiations with the Western Allies. Had the new German government been able to stave off Soviet advances, the country might have sought to align more closely with the West. This would likely have been a strategic move to avoid falling under Soviet control. In this alternate history, Germany could have attempted to form alliances with Italy or Hungary, countries already struggling under the Soviet yoke. Together, they might have launched a joint offensive to push back the Soviet tide in Eastern Europe. However, such an alliance would have been difficult to maintain, given the mistrust between these nations and the West. Internally, the German military leadership would have been in disarray. While figures like Erwin Rommel and Heinz Guderian had the respect of the army and the skills to lead, their views on peace would have been crucial. Rommel, who had already grown disillusioned with Hitler, might have been open to negotiations with the West. Guderian, one of the architects of Germany's blitzkrieg tactics, could have supported peace as well, seeing it as the only way to preserve Germany's military strength for the future. However, hardline officers would have opposed any peace talks, believing that surrender would betray the sacrifices already made. The military's internal struggle would have been one of the greatest obstacles to any lasting peace. The Soviet advance in 1944 was relentless. After the success of Operation Valkyrie, the Red Army pushed the Germans back, reclaiming vast swaths of territory. Without Hitler's interference, the Germans may have had a chance to adapt their strategy and put up a more coordinated defense. Hitler's obsession with micromanaging military tactics had crippled the Wehrmacht for years, but now under the leadership of generals like Rommel and Guderian, the Germans could have made critical adjustments. Rommel, known for his expertise in mobile warfare, would have likely advocated for flexible defenses, utilizing the remaining panzer divisions to strike at key Soviet supply lines and disrupt their advance. Guderian, a master of blitzkrieg tactics, might have pushed for a counter-offensive, aimed at halting the Soviet momentum and retaking lost ground. Could the Germans have mounted a successful counter-offensive? It's possible. With Rommel and Guderian at the helm, the Germans might have been able to leverage their remaining military strength and execute a series of well-coordinated strikes that could have temporarily halted the Soviet advance. However, this would have required a level of coordination and resources that were rapidly dwindling. In response, the German military would have had to implement a series of desperate gambles. They might have concentrated their remaining forces in critical areas, such as the Vistula or the Oder River, hoping to create defensive lines that could delay the Red Army long enough for negotiations with the West. This strategy could have resulted in a stalemate on the Eastern Front, with the Soviets firmly entrenched in the East, while a Western-aligned Germany fought to hold on to its sovereignty. The question would have been whether the Western Allies, still advancing from the West, would have been willing to broker such an arrangement. As the war in Europe progressed, the balance of power would have shifted dramatically with the death of Hitler and the subsequent power change in Germany. With a new German leadership now focused on negotiating peace with the Allies and reorganizing the military, the threat from the West would have significantly diminished. The Germans, no longer shackled by Hitler's destructive strategies, could have put up a much stronger defense against the Soviets. The Red Army's advances, which had been pushing relentlessly across Eastern Europe, would have encountered far more resistance, potentially slowing their progress toward Germany's heartland. This shift could have opened the door for a remarkable, albeit highly speculative, cooperation between Germany and the Allied forces, specifically the US and Britain. Both the Western Allies and Germany shared a common enemy in the Soviet Union, and with Germany's desire to preserve its independence and halt Soviet expansion, the potential for a joint strategy could have emerged. The Allies, still eager to avoid Soviet domination of Europe, might have found it politically advantageous to work with Germany in a concerted effort to push back Stalin's forces in Eastern Europe. This could have resulted in a temporary uneasy alliance, focused on halting Soviet territorial gains, especially in places like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. However, such an alliance would have been fraught with mistrust and strategic difficulties, as the Western Allies were still wary of Germany's long-term intentions. Politically, the post-war landscape would have been dramatically different. A divided Europe, with Germany firmly aligned with the West, would have marked the beginning of a new order. Germany, spared from Soviet control, could have remained an independent state and possibly a key player in Cold War politics. Berlin might have become a central hub of Western influence, serving as a focal point for the ideological struggle between the US and the USSR. The Cold War would have taken on a new dynamic, with a divided Germany at the heart of Europe, not just a divided Berlin. As the war entered its final days, Germany faced a stark choice: surrender or survival. Despite the growing pressure from the Soviet advance in the East and the refusal of the Western Allies to negotiate, the German military, now under new leadership, would have likely chosen to fight on. The decision to resist Soviet occupation at any cost, even if it meant further devastation, would have been seen as Germany's last hope to maintain some semblance of sovereignty and prevent the complete domination of the Soviet Union. The German military, especially figures like Rommel and Guderian, would have rallied their remaining forces for one final stand. They would have fought to delay the Soviet advance, hoping for a break in the situation that could bring a shift in the Western Allies' stance or buy enough time for the Allies to reach a peace agreement with them. The desperation would have been palpable, as the leaders knew that their country was on the brink of collapse, but they could not allow the Soviets to sweep across Europe unopposed. In the West, the collapse of Nazi resistance would have been inevitable. The Allies, having pushed through France and Belgium, would have eventually reached the borders of Germany with no Nazi leadership left to oppose them. Berlin, once the heart of the Nazi regime, would have fallen to the advancing Allied forces, marking the final defeat of Hitler's regime. But even in this final moment, Germany's fate would have been shaped by the unwillingness of the Allies to compromise. The war would end on their terms, with Germany's surrender bringing an end to the brutal chapter of Nazi rule, but the country's future, now uncertain, caught between the competing superpowers of the East and West. In this alternate history scenario, we've explored the dramatic consequences of a successful Operation Valkyrie and how it would have reshaped the course of World War II and the future of Germany. Had Hitler been assassinated on July 20, 1944, Germany might have been saved from total destruction. The German military, led by figures like Ludwig Beck and Claus von Stauffenberg, could have taken control, attempted to negotiate peace with the West, and even formed temporary alliances with the Western powers to halt the Soviet advance. This shift in leadership could have preserved a portion of Germany's sovereignty, potentially keeping it out of Soviet control and reshaping the post-war political landscape. Without the overbearing influence of Hitler's leadership, the war in Europe could have taken a completely different trajectory. While the Allies would likely have rejected peace overtures, Germany might have been able to negotiate a ceasefire, preventing further bloodshed on its soil. However, the Soviets would have remained an insurmountable threat, and Germany's final gamble to resist Soviet occupation would have been a desperate but doomed effort. Now, with the war ultimately ending on the Allies' terms, Germany's fate would have been sealed, divided, occupied, and at the mercy of both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. But we are left to ponder, would this alternate history have led to a better or worse outcome for Germany and the world? What kind of Germany would have emerged after such a tumultuous struggle? Stay tuned for our upcoming videos, where we'll continue to explore fascinating what-if scenarios, examining other moments in history that could have completely changed the world. We'd love to hear your thoughts and theories, so be sure to share them in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more engaging content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.